Good evening. Hello. Welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have you joining us tonight. Thank you for coming. Also, welcome to the online audience who is watching us tonight through the live stream. My name is Astrid Frohloff. I'm a TV moderator and a TV journalist, and I have the pleasure to lead you through tonight's event. When we started to developing this format, this new talk series, Today's Global Leader, we did not expect that in September we would find ourselves in the midst of one of the biggest crises we ever had since World War II. In fact, we are confronted with a simultaneousness of crises, as you all know: pandemic, Ukraine war, climate change, inflation, energy costs, and business leaders are facing upheavals and reversals of unprecedented intensity and speed. Unfortunately, there are no recipes. There is no textbook for managers of how to manage and how to deal with such multiple crises. The more, it's a privilege for us today to talk firsthand to an outstanding leader tonight who probably, I would say, has one of the toughest jobs you can have in these times in Germany as a manager. And we're very, very happy, and it's a great honor for us to welcome the chair of the executive board and CEO Deutsche Lufthansa with us tonight to kick off our series, Today's Global Leader. Please give a very warm welcome to Carsten Spohr. Talking about crisis, do you know that the Chinese word for crisis consists of two characters? The first character resembles kind of a lightning bolt, and this means danger. The second character means opportunity. So I'm very curious to learn whether Carsten Spohr also sees in the crisis opportunities alongside the many dangers we obviously have. So I'm looking very much forward to our conversation, and I think it's going to be highly interesting for you. As you can see, we have many young professionals here today to learn what leadership means for you in such difficult times. So before we start, first of all, I would like to hand over the mic to your hosts tonight. We are grateful that this event is hosted by ESMT and is in cooperation with Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung. And I would like to ask Georg Garlichs to come on stage. First of all, he is the CFO of ESMT Berlin. And then it's my pleasure to turn over to Menges, member of the managing board of the Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung. So please, Mr. Garlichs, stage is yours.
Thank you, Astrid. Dear honored guests and distinguished guests here in the audience and online, we have also an online stream. As the Chief Financial Officer, as you mentioned here, of ESMT Berlin, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our International Business School on this special occasion, the inaugural event of this new series of Today's Global Leaders. We will also have another event with Ola Kelenius in a couple of weeks if you are interested as well. Business expertise and strong leaders can play a vital part in public debate. In Germany, positive leadership and business competence are more important than ever, especially now in times of transformation. The next generations of leaders can learn from the German CEOs, major family businesses, and successful managers who have steered their companies through crisis. And talking about steering a company through crisis, I think our guest today is really a prime example for that, for successfully steering a big company through a big crisis. And as a leading business school in Germany, we at ESMT Berlin want to offer a platform to discuss these leadership issues across generations. As many of you will know, ESMT is still a comparably young business school. We will celebrate at least our 20-year anniversary this year. To be honest, the operations only started a few years later, so actually it's not yet quite 20 years, but at least we do as if. ESMT was founded by leading international companies and institutions based in Germany, such as Deutsche Lufthansa. Without their support, their expertise, their network, and still their continuing participation, many things would not have been possible here in the development of our school. Learning, it turns out, however, always goes both ways. The young learn from the more experienced, but they can also provide relevant feedback and new angles of looking at problems. With today's event, we want to encourage this dialogue between business leaders and seasoned decision makers on the one hand, and students and young professionals on the other. We are honored that Carsten Spohr, Chief Executive Officer of Deutsche Lufthansa, and almost more importantly, member of the Board of Trustees of ESMT Foundation, so the owner actually of our business school, where Mr. Spohr is engaged, and thank you for that also, is joining us tonight as the first business leader, so thank you for coming, Mr. Spohr. I would also like to thank the Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung for the fruitful cooperation and generous support of this series. So, dear guests, here and online, I look forward to an enlightening discussion this evening. Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Uta Menges, member of the Managing Board of the Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung. Uta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. It's a great pleasure for me, too, to welcome you all here, dear guests, here on site as well as online in the live stream. And as a representative of IZF, Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung, I am also very pleased about this excellent cooperation with ESMT to start this wonderful event series. And thank you very much for having us here today. And beyond that, I am very grateful that Carsten Spohr is our first guest and discussion partner today. What a wonderful start for this series of events. Thank you. But before we start with today's keynote speakers, let me give you some insights into IZF, Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung. As our name suggests, the aim of the association is to foster the dialogue about future leadership. And there are three important concepts in that statement we should look at. It's about leadership. It's about questions like, what does leadership mean in times of crisis and change? How can we equip leaders for current challenges? And what competencies are needed to lead virtual teams in a global and digital world? The next term is future. How can we develop leaders to be prepared for future issues? How do we inspire the younger generations to become good future leaders? And what understanding of leadership do we need to guide our teams into the future? And the last term I mentioned is dialogue, sharing different perspectives to gain new insights, reflecting my own opinion by receiving valuable feedback, getting fresh inspiration to broaden my mindset. Listen, contribute, exchange, networking. That is what we do at IZF. All this is relevant for lifelong learning, for future leaders as well as for the current leaders who want to develop further. And so I'm sure that today's event contributes to all these aspects that form the core of IZF, Initiative Zukunftsfähige Führung. So, thank you very much, and I'm happy to hand over to Astrid, our wonderful moderator of today's event.
Well, thank you very much, Uta and George, for these kind greeting remarks. Well, we will talk about leadership in challenging times today, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you, first of all, someone who is indeed a great expert in leadership. Professor Konstantin Korotov, he is professor of organizational behavior here at ESMT in Berlin. He is faculty lead in the executive MBA program. And in addition to his research and teaching, you have over 25 years of global practical leadership development experience. So looking forward to your remarks. Welcome, Mr. Korotov.
Good evening. Good evening, dear students, dear graduates, dear former students, dear participants in our executive education program. So this is a great opportunity for me to welcome the key audience of our events, but also welcome to all those who are interested in leadership and, of course, to those people who are ready to talk about leadership today. So here at ESMT, we talk about our mission as a business school that, from the heart of Europe, creates and impacts new knowledge to advance business and society. We develop entrepreneurial leaders who think globally and act responsibly. But what do we mean by that? How do we actually develop leaders? How do we take on ourselves this difficult and almost kind of over-ambitious task, developing global leaders? And actually, what does it mean to develop leaders? And what does leadership mean in general? How do we define this term? Well, I should tell you something that is related to my personal experience. Many years ago, when I decided to move from the corporate world to academia, I told my then very attentive advisor that I wanted to study leadership, and she told me, Konstantin, don't even try to do that. We'll never allow you to defend your dissertation. She says there's going to be so many people who have a completely different view on what leadership is and what it is not, that it's going to be very difficult for you to convince all those narcissistic professors who believe that they know everything about this particular field. So maybe you should study salespeople. So basically, those salespeople are the ones who are critically important for every organization, but nobody pays attention to them, so that if you interview them and if you ask them about their leaders, they're going to talk. Well, I didn't listen, and that was probably a good thing, and I embarked on the study of leadership, and I find this still a very exciting and fascinating area, including an attempt to try to figure out how different people define leadership. However, for our purposes, for the purposes of developing leaders, we need to offer something to our students. We need to start somewhere, and so I do have a working definition for this, and this working definition I borrow from an American philosopher, Joanne Schuler. Joanne Schuler is currently at the Rutgers University, and she's one of the pioneers of the studies in the field of ethical leadership. So here is her definition that I'm using when I'm working with my students and I'm working with my executive education participants. So Schuler says that leadership is a complex moral psychological phenomenon of relationships among people that is based on trust, obligations, emotions, and a common understanding of what is good. So in a nutshell, a leader in her, his organization, tries to come together with her, his teams, with her, his people, with her, his stakeholders, with her, his customers, to a common understanding of what is good. What do we do, what we do not do? How do we do it? What are some of the critical steps for us in defining where we should be going in the future? So it's all about defining what is good. Feel free to agree or disagree with this definition, but this is a working definition for me, for our purposes of working with the leaders. And of course, every woman or man who has made it to the top of the organization probably defines his own way of thinking about what is good in their environment, what is good in their circumstances. And for us, for all those who choose to follow certain leaders or who choose to interact with certain organizations, for example, when we're buying stock or when we are deciding to use the services or products of that organization, or when we are talking about that particular organization and its members to the rest of the world, we are probably trying to find out what is that happening in that particular place, how the particular leader in that particular environment defines what is good, and then we decide whether we subscribe to that, whether we want to be part of that particular journey. So I think that's why we should care. Academically, however, as a professor, I cannot not mention academic stuff, right? So academically, we also have a theory about this, and this is called the upper echelon theory. And the upper echelon theory that has its roots in 1980s says that senior organizational leaders interpret their situations based on their values, personalities, and experiences. And as a result, the latter, so these values, personalities, and experiences, get reflected in the strategies that are formulated and executed. So for us, whatever we do with that particular organization, whether we analyze its performance, whether we think about its future, whether we are considering whether we are going to use again so their services or products, it becomes very interesting to maybe find out how the leaders in that organization define what is good, what's going into their definition, how their values and experiences influence the outcomes that we see at the end of the day in the business performance or in the services and products that we receive. So, to some extent, we are going back to where the whole science of leadership, or this maybe art of leadership, started. We are trying to figure out what stands behind a person in a leadership role. What is, in her or his opinion, is important for them and for the organization, and probably also for the world. Research, however, is finding it very difficult to get access to the inner theaters of those leaders, to their values, to their hopes, to their anxieties, to their aspirations, to the things that keep them awake at night and make them get up in the morning and go and meet with the people, handle disgruntled customers, talk to concerned analysts, and actually take the organization further. So we often deal with the second-hand accounts of leadership. Sometimes these are good journalistic accounts, sometimes these are embellished biographies, sometimes these are case studies written by us, where we are actually trying to find some faults with the leaders, and then we're trying to discuss it with the students how to avoid those faults. But again, so these are very often second-hand stories. So that's why it's utterly important for us to be able to see what is happening with the people who are currently in the leadership role. And in the research that we conduct here at ESMT, together with the colleagues from ESADE Business School in Spain, we know that people who are thinking about going into a leadership role very often make so-called exemplar comparisons. They look at their own set of values, and then they look at the set of values that are presented to them by the current leaders, by people who are currently in leadership positions in the organizations. And people are asking themselves the question, do I want to be like her? Do I want to be like him? Do I want to do something differently? How am I going to lead when I get a chance? And actually, does it make sense for me to strive to get into that position? Unfortunately, very often I'm running leadership development programs and people come to me, they have been sent by their companies to leadership development programs and tell me, how do I not become a leader? If I become a leader, basically, I'm probably going to get so much more responsibility. I'm very comfortable where I am now, but the organization kind of expects me to do more. Is there a way for me not to be a leader? And I think it's probably also an important question to ask. We do not want people in those positions who do not want to be there. So we need to provide them with a realistic job preview of what it takes to be a leader and what it means to be leading in today's environment, as you've heard, as you experience yourself, that is not necessarily conducive to easy work or easy life. What we also know, and this is something that comes from an executive search and leadership development firm, Egon Zehnder. So they have recently surveyed 1,000 CEOs of the largest global corporations, and what they have concluded from this research is that executives find themselves, and now let me quote, in a louder, more diverse and more divergent set of voices among their various stakeholders, who also want to know about the leaders' stand on critical issues and who want also sometimes to figure out who is the person behind the leadership actions in the organizations. I should also say that with that, we as a society are probably doing a big disservice to many of the leaders in the organization. I think it's our job to create an environment like we are trying to create here at ESMT and in this series, create an environment where people can talk about what it takes to be a leader without the psychological risk of being ridiculed, made fun of, criticized, let's say to the extent that the personality is affected. So we need to figure out a way to talk about serious leadership issues, challenges, mistakes in an environment of psychological safety without creating the feeling of the cancel culture that only prevents people from talking honestly about what it takes to lead and prevents us from learning about leadership. So we've been trying to do this here at ESMT, and of course we cannot do it without the real leaders. So that is why I'm extremely thankful, first of all, to Carsten Spohr and then to all the other leaders who are joining us in this event, to EFC that is helping us create this opportunity so that we can actually get into a feeling of what it takes to lead today. So from the academic and teaching perspective, I expect several outcomes of this series of events. It should help current leaders compare and contrast their situation with that of our speakers, of those who come and share their stories with us. It should help the general public understand better the cost of living rather than jumping at judgments about leaders' personal qualities. And most importantly, it should help our key audience, the students from ESMT and from other universities, all those who are interested in learning from what we are doing here at ESMT, how to prepare themselves or what to prepare themselves for, to have so-called realistic job review, another academic term, about what it takes to be in a leadership role. So I would like to thank all those who are willing to help us in this learning journey, and I'm very grateful to the opportunity to keep learning myself. So thank you very much and enjoy today's event.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Korotov, for these wonderful statements and for this input. And let's see if we can meet your expectations here on stage. And I won't add any more. I want to ask our guest to come on stage and join me. Carsten Spohr, please come with me and take a seat. Okay, so you can sit over here. And I suggest that we will have a conversation, first of all, here on stage. And then you are invited to put questions as well. Also, the online audience is invited. So, Mr. Spohr, you are not only the CEO of Deutsche Lufthansa, you're managing the Lufthansa Group with all its business segments. You are a pilot yourself. You're holding the Lufthansa captain's license. And I think we all know that pilots have to be very stress resistant, very calm, very focused. So can you tell us which of your skills as a pilot have helped you most to get through the past 2 years?
Yeah, first of all, good evening. And that question already shows you, unless you already work at Lufthansa, you now know that at Lufthansa, one job doesn't pay a living, you need two. And that's why I indeed keeping my pilot's license alive. On this topic, I just realized when I listened to you, if I ever become a professor or become in academia, I will get my PhD on that question, because pilots versus management, and the versus sometimes indeed is true, sometimes there are conflict, but there's indeed some overlaps. So I want to be brief, but this one I think is an important topic, and of course we discuss a lot within Lufthansa. First of all, especially when it comes to leadership in crisis, there is a comparison. If you're in an airplane, or at least if you're in an airborne airplane, whatever problem arises, no landing is no option. You have to bring the airplane down. And you need the positivism and the self-confidence that you will manage that. If you are becoming nervous, if this ever will be survivable, if the aircraft ever will get down safely, how can you express confidence to your crew or to the passengers, those people you basically were entrusted with? So I think that positive element of one way or another, this crisis will end. One way or another, you bring the aircraft down safely, I think is key in a crisis. People become nervous too quickly. Surely that's the beginning of the end. That's the second thing. Our instructors in flight school always told us when something happens in the cockpit, some light goes on or some noise comes up, don't touch anything. Sit on your fingers initially and observe and get an understanding of the situation. I think crisis management as a hyperactive form of management is exactly the wrong thing. The more the crisis hits you, I think the more structured you or your leadership team needs to be, and that surely in a way is trained in a cockpit. Then, to be a little bit more detailed, maybe, we have a wonderful formula in our cockpits how to deal with any crisis, which consists of 6 letters. It's called FORDEC. It means first, facts. Second, O, options. Third, what are the risks? And award, by the way, in the management, in an airplane, there's not much award, there's only risks. What are the risks of each of these options? Then take a decision, D, then execute the decision, and C, FORDEC, check the decision if you were right or wrong, which, by the way, is a wonderful example of where cockpit and management is different. We all love just culture and the idea of learning from mistakes. In the cockpit, we do that. Whatever happens, any pilot can turn to his bosses, talk about his or her problems. Even if a crew with each other believes they need that kind of a talk, they can have it. This will never be published. We'll always keep that internally to learn from it. In management, you don't have that luxury, neither in the company or in senior management, even in public. As you all know, we surely went through a crisis in June and July this year when everything around the main airports in Europe blew up, and it was not just Europe, to be honest. And we wrote a letter apologizing to our customers, and we said in the letter, this was also our first pandemic. We made some mistakes, which in a just culture you would think, wow, great. And the cockpits, we do that all the time. Being public, of course, the whole world jumps on you. I could have told you before. Somebody always did know before. We need strong leadership. We don't want leadership that is weak. So there are limits to how you can compare pilots to managers. And last but not least, that's maybe the most important thing. In the pilot environment, we try to minimize risks. In a crisis, but also even before the crisis, basically before you take off. As a manager, if you always minimize risks, you don't get anywhere. Surely entrepreneurship involves risks. And some of the top leaders in companies have taken risks. When we promote young people to very senior positions, everybody always thinks that's great, and my HR people tell me, oh, that's how we need to do it. And usually the person, when you call him or her in, you tell her you get this great job, oh, wonderful. Nobody understands there's a huge risk involved with that as well. If you don't perform, that probably is something, at least in our unfortunate European culture, a little different in the US culture. Risk is not awarded with that much credit. And that, of course, in the cockpit is minimized. And again, in management, I think we have to individually and also as a management team willing to take risks. I'll stop now, but again, I could talk about this for hours, you can tell.
Yeah, but let's go back to a concrete risk you were facing. I mean, before the pandemic, you really successfully restructured Lufthansa. Earnings, passengers numbers were at a record high. You have been manager of the year. And then we've got COVID-19 with horrible consequences. You yourself gave this horrible number. You said in the beginning of the pandemic, Lufthansa lost every hour about 1 million euros of its liquidity reserves. I mean, this is a number it's hardly to imagine how you deal with this. How did you personally deal with this situation? What went through your minds in these days?
Yeah, I think one element indeed is, I don't know if I call it optimism, because that's maybe too strong a word, but positivism maybe is a better word. You have to believe that there is light at the end of this tunnel one way or another, because if you as a leader don't express that confidence, I go back to my pilot example, how can the organization be expected to follow you? Yeah, so in German, wenn Sie andauernd sagen, ich weiß auch nicht weiter, that's probably not the strongest leadership you execute in that regard. So I think that's one thing which probably to a certain degree comes with personality. It comes with your private and social background, with your family. My wife played a huge role in that, but also comes with the team you're leading in. Yeah, are you giving confidence to each other? Or is the team thinking, wow, this is a crisis, this is time to kill the boss and get the job myself? That's probably not the strongest team then for managing a crisis. So I think that's an element of this. And also not just strongly believing in it, but also being able to express it. And that probably has some irrational elements. So in the case of Lufthansa, even in those darkest days, I said this company has basically been around 100 years. Can I imagine aviation without Lufthansa? Can I imagine the German government looks at the German global economy without a Lufthansa being our home carrier? No, and indeed, as you all know, they did help us, like other governments help their airlines. So there's a mix, I think, of rational, irrational elements of stabilizing yourself and then allowing to stabilize the organization. But let me add, because the biggest crisis I've been through in Lufthansa, it was not COVID. That was clearly when we lost the aircraft in 2015. So I think when it's just, I know you're all business, people and business students, in the end it's just money. Even going bankrupt, huh? People don't die when a company goes bankrupt. If you lose an aircraft and 150 people die, that's a crisis of a different dimension. Or coming back to the pilot, to avoid people to die That's a different thing than just money. So don't get me wrong, maybe my supervisory board is also listening. I take money very serious, otherwise I wouldn't be having the job I do. But when it comes to crisis, we all learn that without trying to change the path here, what happens in Ukraine, suddenly theoretical things become very practical when it's about life and death. So I think in that regard, I read a lot of books about military leaders, even though I've never been in the military, because I think that's even the toughest form of leadership when it comes to life and death. So sometimes putting yourself into the perspective, how important is the problem, what's the worst thing that can happen, will also help you to stabilize and not to become nervous.
Well, financial-wise, Lufthansa is doing much better now, but at the same time, you still have to face these multiple crises. The head of your supervisory board, Karl Ludwig Clay, said, "In my career, I have not seen such an accumulation of problems." So how steer the big bird when there is turbulence all around at the same time? This is the problem we are facing now.
Well, one advice is when a crisis like this happens, try to be supervisory board chairman and not executive board chairman. So that's because it's less operational. No, seriously, we managed this crisis together, Herr Klei and I, because in the end this was indeed about the future of Lufthansa all the way down to the question of survival of the company. But I think my answer is not very different from my answers before. I think the formulas I described, confident in the company, in the legacy of the company, which hopefully gives stability for the future, in a way, let's be honest, confidence into yourself. If you start to have too much self-doubt in such a situation, how can you express the strength the organization requires from you? So I think that is all part of the answers I've been given before. And in a way, of course, the Lufthansa management and probably airline management in general, you are quite trained for a crisis. So I think there's numerous crises in an airline throughout the years. And we were not hit, as I mentioned before, also as a team, with some of the people I worked with for many years now, with a crisis for the first time. And I think it was quite interesting. I'm not going to mention names now, but if you look at some other leaders in some other companies in COVID who probably had the first crisis in their individual lives and also in the life of the company, how they completely left it or lost it. So crisis is like a little bit like sport. You also always get, in a way, trained for it. It's a little bit unfortunate. I always get invited to crisis management talks. Other people get invited as CEOs for visionary leadership or for innovation or shareholder maximization. I always get invited for crisis management. So maybe one day that changes.
Yeah. But in summer this year, we have seen that many things went wrong indeed with Lufthansa. We had this chaos at the airports, flight cancellations, long waiting lines, staff shortages. We have all experienced this. And then on top, you had these many strikes. So how justified was the criticism of you?
Well, if you are such a public manager as probably the CEO of an airline, maybe in general, but surely a Lufthansa, or your next guest, the CEO of Daimler, or think about Mr. Dies and now Mr. Blume, the CEO of Volkswagen, or Deutsche Bank, Christian Sewing, you have to live with the fact that you are looked at and criticized. Sometimes this balance, sometimes the other balance. So I think that's something which comes with a job. If you are running the largest German waste management company, I don't even know what that is, you're probably in the papers less often. So it's
but
partly
you also
part of the
apologized, right? And you admit that.
No, that's why I'm saying that's something I cannot complain about, right? Being criticized in general, because again, the company is so visible, so is not just the one leader, in our case, so are leaders in Lufthansa. So then, second, a brand like Lufthansa, or a product, I need to say, which so many people experience individually, obviously creates a lot of public reaction beyond the role of the person who actually looks at you as a stakeholder. So when I see my largest shareholders, funds in London or New York, they're very professional people, maybe some of you work for such a fund, it takes 10 minutes and they come to their next Lufthansa experience or the last. So nobody can differentiate. If I talk to a minister in Germany, they, after a few minutes, engage with you on their last experience, or their son, or their neighbors, or their wives or husbands' experience. So there is an emotional attachment to the product because we experience it all so often that you have to live with that reflection which goes beyond just shareholder value or the share price. On the other hand, to answer a little bit more honestly, we did think that some of the criticism was unfair because this was our first pandemic, as I have said. And I was surprised that so many, or other way around, that so few people admitted that, also politicians. Rather than covering up your mistakes and trying to explain why, by the way, I've learned it's not a mistake, it's an error. A mistake is something you do knowing that you should have done something different. An error is something where you didn't know that you're doing it wrongly. Okay. I don't know if that's true, Mr. Professor, but so doing something wrong, an error in a situation you've never been through, like a pandemic, or in our case, ramping up the company basically from 0 to now 80% within months or in Easter weeks. Who could do that without failure? And it was very interesting. I once made a comment in a press conference that I said, I never promised the world that I would lead Lufthansa through this pandemic with no mistakes. I just promised to do it better than others. Some journalists found that the best quote ever, and some criticized me for being so unambitious. Okay. Anyway, so in that, like politicians, CEOs of visible companies, you have to live with the fact that criticism is part of that job description.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the business at Lufthansa itself. Can you outline a little bit what is your strategy now for the future of Lufthansa, especially when it comes to your brand? I mean, what are you planning? How will Lufthansa position itself as a brand to expand premium and comfort, or strengthens cheap and low-cost services?
That question is very easy. The first one is Lufthansa is a premium brand. The legacy of Lufthansa is premium. We became out of nowhere. We were started in 1955 after being grounded for 10 years after the war. We became #1 in Europe, not because we were the lowest cost airline or whatever. We became #1 because we were offering premium services with premium people, premium staff. So that's the legacy, that's the USP. If we lose that, I think the Lufthansa has lost its future. Have we always delivered premium the last months? We surely have not. So I think it's now time to reinvest, and we are investing. It's not just, by the way, money and new aircraft and new seats and new lounges. That's all coming too. It's, by the way, and you will like that, it's investing in people. We have not sent our people to any of these programs for 2.5 years. By the way, there's nobody here from Lufthansa today. That's because all the flights are so full they couldn't get here. We have not invested in promotions because we didn't promote people. We cut our workforce from 140,000 to 100,000. So these things we're now turning around. Investment into the brand, which in our case is 100% linked to our people. We fly the same airplane as other companies, but our people, our staff, is just performing, and we try to perform 100% on that level in a premium way. Now you're all going to have the story where that didn't find out it wasn't true, okay? But we try to get there, and that is clearly where we put the company back to. And we have stabilized the companies in the last weeks. We're now back at more than 99% regularity, and now next are investments in our premium product, again, including the people, which are the core part of our premium product. Mm.
And how do you deal with a situation which was not predictable, the impact of the Ukraine war and now the rising energy costs? How does this affect your business?
Yeah, with all the problems we have in Lufthansa, some of them, I guess, got me on the stage here because we have more problems than others. That one is a little less of an impact for us. Why? Energy costs already for Lufthansa are somewhere between 30% and 40%. As an airline. So that's something we always have looked at, how to minimize our energy cost, in our case, our fuel cost. When fuel costs rise, as they did the last month due to the war, they rise for everybody around the world. So the level playing field, which for me is the most important thing to compete really globally like we do, is not really disturbed by higher energy costs. It's kept. It makes it difficult for everybody, which is different. If you run a chemical company in Germany and your gas price has gone up 5 times, you try to export your product against some American competitor, and he doesn't have the raise in energy cost, you obviously have a special problem. So I think in our case, sensitivity for energy costs was always there in an airline. And again, what's happening is a global element, not distorting the level playing field. But of course, the potential recession in Germany, that people have less consumer spend, that is an impact for us, since 1/3 of our passengers are German, And one of the sad truths is that we are steering away our seats a little bit towards other markets where there is more purchasing power, probably especially in 23, like the United States. Yeah, the dollar also plays in the favor of our American customers. So compared to before the crisis, we're selling a lot more seats now on our airplane in the US, flying to Europe and back, than we're selling seats in Europe, flying to the US and back. So we have the ability to a little bit use the global difference in economic development to minimize the impact. But again, Germany is our largest market, so we will feel a potential recession, I think, which we all find quite likely to occur.
So what does this mean for ticketing and the flight prices for us as passengers?
They will not go down to the levels we have seen before the pandemic, which were too low, by the way. I think it's irresponsible to fly for 9 euros or 10 euros or 20. We will see very stable, maybe even raising ticket prices for the next years, because also like in many other industries, suddenly the supply is not vanishing, but it's coming down. We are lacking pilots in the US. We're lacking aircraft around the world because both Boeing and Airbus have problems putting out their airplanes. We're lacking people on the ground to handle our airplanes, especially in Europe. We're lacking infrastructure and air traffic control capabilities in many parts of the world. So basically the supply is more or less leveled or limited by all these global factors, and the demand not being where it was before the pandemic but coming back nicely puts pressure on that demand that, as we all know, in semester one brings up prices, which is healthy for the industry because, again, prices were too low, margins for the industries were too low, investments of the industries, many companies were too low. So that's a good thing for us as a company and as an industry and as a consumer. You know that prices are going up everywhere, including aviation and airplane tickets.
Let me bring up another topic. Early, when you were still head of Lufthansa Cargo, the media named you the environmental captain. And this is why Carsten Spohr was very close to the topic of climate protection. Since many years, he's supporting this issue. And today, Lufthansa has set ambitious goals in order to become carbon neutral. Since many years, Lufthansa is indeed a pioneer in sustainable aviation fuel. So how do we get to zero-emission flying? Because this is one of the big topics we have ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for all those nice words. And indeed, we are proud as a company to not only follow this trend, which now everybody is doing, at least before COVID, as you all know, that was the only thing people talked about. Then everybody talked about COVID, and now everybody talks about energy. Yeah, we live in a culture where there's always apparently only room for one topic in the brains and minds of people. But we were not just following that trend, we were partly setting it. And that comes with the fact that I think us in Europe, we're a little bit further when it comes to sensitivity of this topic than other parts of the world. And in the global industry that helped initially, now it turns into a disadvantage because there's some crazy ideas in Brussels how to disadvantage European airlines against others. But overall, our goal is clear. By 2030, we want to halve our CO2 emissions. By 2050, we want to be at zero. How will that be happening? One element is modernizing the fleet. But let's be honest, a new aircraft basically reduces emissions by 20%, and only the current generation does that to the last generation. There is no next generation inside, really. There's no technology answer. So modernizing, yes, but it will only bring it down, not bring it to zero. So the big thing we are doing to bring it to zero will be synthetic fuels. And this is very small as of today, even though we are the largest customer of synthetic fuels in our industry in the world. We have put $250 million aside for the next 4 years to buy synthetic fuels, if we can get them, because you can hardly get them. But even all that is very small compared to what we need. If Lufthansa takes all the synthetic fuels in the world and would be able to buy it, not talking about prices, let's assume for whatever reason I buy it, the fleet wouldn't even last a week with that. So there's a huge way to go, and in my view, even though I believe in private entrepreneurship, this cannot be done by private investments alone. We will need governments and technology and universities, maybe not business schools, but technical universities, to work hand in hand to create those volumes of synthetic fuels, at least we in aviation need. In other industries, there might be other options. I'm sure Herculenius will talk about electric cars, who can, of course, also be only CO2 neutral when the electricity is green. which is the same electricity we need to create synthetic fuels, power to fuel. So we need huge amounts of electric energy, clean energy, to produce all that synthetic fuel, to bring our industry to zero, and other industries need to be helped as well. So for this generation of next leadership, partly being trained here, that's a huge job to be done. And let's be honest, we have anywhere yet an idea how we're going to get there in a country where we turn off nuclear power plants. So this will not happen in Germany. This will need to happen somewhere in Africa where we have enough sunlight, maybe somewhere where we have thermal energy, hydro energy, and then turn that into fuel, synthetic fuel, power to fuels, which then can be used in aviation. Huge job ahead of us. But it must be done.
Okay, this brings me back to the topic of leadership. So why did you decide not to put the ecological transformation in your company backwards, to put it on a back seat in regard to all the many other problems you have to solve right now? I'm saying this because there was just a new survey by Bundesverband Deutsche Industrie. The survey says that 42% of the companies surveyed will postpone investments in ecological transformation for the time being because of all the other problems they have to solve now. So how does one make a decision as a leader? Where is your priority in difficult times?
Well, maybe I'm blessed compared to other industries that some of the decisions we take to reduce our CO2 footprint are not contrary to optimizing other parameters, but are in line. Think about new fleet investments. That's not only good for less CO2, it's also good for our customers because new airplanes have better products on board, better seats, are less noisy. They are also good in terms of cost savings because they burn less fuel, obviously, which for us, as I said, is above 30%. So not all these decisions we take are in conflict with other parameters, which maybe is different in other industries. Mm-hmm. Then maybe more than in other industries, in our case, every stakeholder, and I always think there's 4 stakeholder groups, I'll come to it in a minute, all 4 stakeholder groups expect us to do so. Our customers, our staff, especially the young staff, our shareholders ask for it, and the public, the environment we live in, the political environment, the public audience. So all 4 kind of put pressure on us to do it. Are they willing to also put their money in for it? That's not the case, unfortunately. So governments want us to do more, but if I need them to help me in Brussels to create a level playing field, even executing in Germany what's in the Koalitionsvertrag, I have huge problems, at least with some ministries. So that's where sometimes talking and acting are not in line. Passengers, we have in Lufthansa more than in any other airlines facilitated customers to compensate their CO2 when flying with us, all the way from planting trees to buying synthetic fuels for their flight. 85% of our passengers have answered they want us to offer such a compensation mechanism. 1% use it because it's costing money. It's 500 euros to the US and back, additional money to have synthetic fuels being used, 50 euros within Germany. So also there, when people start to be asked to pay for things, people tend to be maybe less convinced than they are just having a beer and having a philosophical discussion over it. One of the big issues, I believe, in general for climate change and the way we deal with it in our environment, in our world. And also shareholders, if I tell them, yeah, I can do this and that, but it will reduce our profit, then suddenly the excitement comes down. Or one large shareholder visited me the other day with his private jet and said, Carsten, we really need to talk about sustainability. So part of, I think, what we all who bear responsibility need to do, politicians, journalists, corporate leaders, create more honesty on this discussion. Yeah, I think nowadays it's very easy to have a public debate in a dishonest way, which, by the way, as we talk about leadership, is one of the worst things, I think, in leadership. You just don't want to be lied at, yeah, by your leader, by your political leader, by your corporate leader. And I think, yeah, to be honest, to be viewed as being honest, but to be authentic, I would always say is the #1 leadership ability, be it in crisis or in good times. And on this topic we're discussing now, sustainability, I sometimes miss honesty and authentic behavior.
Do you need courageousness as well? I mean, how courageous and how important is it for you to take a stand on political issues? Mr. Korotov mentioned this briefly. We all know that, if you lean too much out of the window, you can fall very deep, and eventually you earn bad shitstorms in the internet. If you really have a clear standpoint in regard to political issues. So, where is your limit, or where are your personal restrictions? And you say, okay, this is nothing I would comment on.
Well, I just come from Bild Zeitung, so you're very on time with that question.
Okay.
Because I did not answer some questions. Why? I think, let's be the other way around. Where do you have to be outspoken as a CEO? When it's political decisions which impact your company, be it your staff, like the mask. I had to do everything I can to get that stupid mask away, because it drove my staff on board crazy in the planes, and it drove my passengers crazy, and no other airline was doing it. So, by the way, one of the heroes of that is sitting here in the front, Mrs. Courant. We pulled all strings to convince the public and politicians that this is crazy, that we're the only airline left where people have to wear masks, and it's got more and more difficult for my team on board, my crews, to execute that obligation, that rule, when passengers more and more understand no other airline does it. So that was something I think we had to be outspoken. Or we, as you might remember, when we were saved by the government, we once said no to the saving package offered to us, which in a way was brave, but we just couldn't accept some of the limitations. We then renegotiated, had a better, more fair and balanced deal. So there I think you need to be courageous. What I personally always think is a more thin line to walk is when you talk on something completely different. And then I sometimes think you better have your back against the wall before you start to talk about other problems. So Carsten Spohr explaining our chancellor how to run the government of this country, I better know that I run my company in a great way before I tell our chancellor how to run this much larger challenge of running this country. Or some other corporate leaders, or the head of a university. You better know in that regard, where are you within your own performance? And there I think it's a little bit easier, because with an airline there's almost so much criticism what should be better in an airline, about luggage, about food, that you're never in a position that you don't have any criticism on you. So I tend to be a little bit more careful on telling other leaders, including political leaders, how to do their job, and rather focus on doing my job better. Again, with the exception when it has an impact on my company, on the people I'm responsible for, be it my passengers or be it my staff members, then I think it's part of my job to speak out.
Well, let's address another topic which is very close to leadership questions. The global pandemic forced many companies into home office. So how did work and work structures change at Lufthansa? How did your, let's say, your communication and your cooperation with your staff changed during the past 2 years?
Yeah, I have to split that answer in the operational requirements. We were all going through in the middle of the pandemic. Like every company, we had to put our people at home. We had to split teams in case somebody gets infected. The other team could run the company. And remember, in an airline, it's 24/7. I cannot stop Lufthansa. There's always an airplane in the air. There's hundreds in the air while we speak, but even in the pandemic, there were a few dozens in the air. My operations center needed to be manned to support these aircraft. So we did all the things, and maybe even more than other companies, including home office, including splitting teams who didn't see each other to keep the company operational feasible. But once that is over, I have a very, very clear view on how home office is now the new way to work. I think it's a disaster. People don't engage with each other in creating new ideas. People don't feel each other anymore on the way to the cafeteria or walking into somebody on the aisle and talking about something you wouldn't have called that person for. There's no spontaneous anymore. There's no emotional discussion anymore, because even when you have a video conference, you think twice if you hit that button or raise that stupid hand to make a comment. In a meeting, you maybe burst out, or you see somebody else who wants to burst out, but maybe who's not senior enough that he or she is willing to burst out. So you say, hey, I can see you're unhappy. Let's hear your voice. That doesn't happen in a video. So I think, especially now with leadership and training the next leadership generation, we should be honest. There is an element of better quality of life working from home sometimes. absolutely fair to say that. Even I don't go to the office 5 days a week, 10 weeks in a row. I take a day off, half a day off, take my children to school. That's fine, and there's more acceptance for that than before. I think fine, but let's be honest, we do that to optimize our lifestyles, not to optimize our work. And then there's an element of recruiting people and being an attractive employer. So sometimes you have to give in. I just came back from the US yesterday, Silicon Valley, people have to give in sometimes for people being away 4 weeks because they don't have a house or home anymore in the Silicon Valley. They want to work out of Texas, and if you don't allow that person to work out of Texas half a year, that person goes to another tech company, which also shows you how little emotional attachment there is. So there is this element of being an attractive employer. Fine. But overall, I think we shouldn't think that working from home is a new way we as leaders and those we lead are optimizing our companies. I think if you don't like people, certain jobs probably are not the right jobs for you. There's wonderful jobs to be at home. My mother-in-law is an artist. She loves to be home in her atelier and create a piece of art. But that's not the job I've chosen. So I rather like to be with my people, or I'm in the wrong job. And that, I think, is a very difficult message in a company. So my colleagues always tell me I'm old-fashioned, and Herr Spohr, seien Sie vorsichtig, wir kriegen keine Talente mehr. I don't want somebody to join Lufthansa to work from home. If somebody doesn't like people, he shouldn't be working for my company. 90% of the people in Lufthansa are in uniform and are on shift plans. They have no choice if they want to work from home. They even have no choice when they want to work. We tell them, if the LH400 leaves at 10 o'clock, the crew better be there at 8 o'clock, or LH400 will not leave at 10 o'clock. No discussion on that. If now 10% of our staff, administrative staff, think they work for Google or work for some advertisement company where everything is about creativity working from home, our company culturally will have a huge gap. I don't want that, so again, I give in to people optimizing their lifestyles, spending some time at home. I give in people having a sick kid and rather work from home because on that day they cannot leave their kids alone. All these things, fortunately, with video are possible, but let's not believe as leaders that the future of work is all of us sitting at home and talking to each other on video.
So that means, as a leader, you have to make sometimes decisions which are not very much accepted by your employees all the time. Oh.
That's what leadership is. Leadership is not taking my kids to the movies. Leadership is taking my kids to the piano teacher.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, to the movies, they go alone. Yeah. So leadership is making people do things which are good for whatever we are responsible for. Yeah. It's great if people also enjoy that. We try to create an environment in Lufthansa that people like what we lead them to do, okay? But leadership doesn't stop when people don't like it.
Okay, but at the same time, just one last question to this topic, because it's, I understand completely what you mean, but it's going to be difficult because at the same time, you said yourself, you have to hire 20,000 new employees within the next 18 months.
Anybody interested?
Oh.
Not after my comments about home office, right? So, I know my HR people will give me that feedback. So kriegen wir nie Leute, Herr Spohr, von der ESMT, wenn Sie so reden.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is, I mean, how do you make yourself attractive as an employee in times like this when everybody's offering home office and, you know, make it more comfortable for employees?
Of course, again, we do offer home office at Lufthansa, just in case you're interested. I just don't want you to be home 5 days a week. I think I expressed that. Yeah, let me give you an arrogant answer. Lufthansa has been one of the top employers in Germany for many years. And beyond Germany, we surely suffered. Also, our employer brand suffered in COVID, no doubt. We were not operating. We were in the media with our operational problems. So we have to invest into that also employer brand, and we are while we speak. But in the end, I think working in aviation, working for a brand like Lufthansa, working with people who love international topics, an airline, who can be more international than an airline? We tend to attract top talents. And our fluctuation is among the lowest, not just in Germany, in corporate Germany, it's among the lowest also in the airline environment, because we are basically a company where people like to work for. I think we're even on the opposite side of the curve, that sometimes people who are not happy anymore rather stay unhappy at Lufthansa than try to be happy somewhere else. Yeah, that sounds like a nice problem to have, but it's also a problem. There should be some research done on that. I have not read any book on that one. There must be some other companies with strong brands. I'm sure Ole Kolenius can talk about that. That companies almost have too much attraction, and then it's difficult for people who are not happy to take a decision. So overall, again, I strongly believe in our attractiveness, but again, we'll need to do things like opening up our new trainee programs, becoming more international. We moved to English some time ago to attract more international talent. New ways of working. We all know what that means, not just home office, offer sabbaticals, offer coming to ESMT to be further educated. These are things a modern employer must do, including Lufthansa, and we do. But in the end, I also want people who are emotionally attracted to what we do. My parents were visiting last Christmas, and I drove my 75-year-old mother and father to the airport, and the Lufthansa 747 was landing, and I was doing this. My mom, of course, always complains, even though I'm now 55, I shouldn't be driving so fast. And why do you look after the airplanes? You have seen so many. Look on the road. And I told her, well, because I still love the sight of a landing Lufthansa airplane. And we got them to the airport safely, but
I hope so.
Not everybody has to have the same emotions, but if people don't have any emotions at all to what we do, I think that is an element missing. So I think we create emotions in Lufthansa. We have a very important purpose, connecting people, cultures, and economies. I think which even in COVID or with terrible wars going on, even proved to be more important to connect people, cultures, and economies in a sustainable way. So I think that, and hopefully having leaders people like to work for, is something we do to attract top people.
Okay, now...
Are you interested?
Well, there was a good commercial break. But I would like to give the audience the opportunity to put questions now to you. And I think there are probably questions. Over here, I see Jill, MBA student here at ESMT. Can we quickly get a microphone, please? Yeah. Okay. I think it's better to have a mic, and then everybody gets her, and also the audience online audience can hear you. Please, Jill.
So I want to start by saying thank you for joining us. My question to you was, with the market and competitive landscape constantly changing, what are 3 essential qualities that you have acquired or habits that you practice to lead Lufthansa through the years? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about me too much, but what we expect from leaders, because the number 3 triggered this, I always like to use 3 things. 1 is ambition, 2 is responsibility, and 3 is empathy. And I always say to our leaders, they somehow have to be in that triangle. If somebody works in sales, maybe he needs to have a little bit more empathy and a little bit less responsibilities, because sometimes in sales you have to cut corners. If my safety pilots doesn't need to have empathy that much, I surely want him to be very responsible. If I put somebody to open up a new business unit to start from scratch, I want that person to be very ambitious, to create a new company out of nothing. So it's somewhere in that triangle, depending on your job, where you should be positioned, but every leader should have a certain element of those 3 parts of leadership, in my view. Again, responsibility, ambition, and empathy. And very important, you cannot replace one by the other. If somebody has no responsibility at all, he cannot be over-ambitious to compensate for his lack of responsibility. Everybody needs to be in the triangle. Within that triangle, you can, of course, be closer to one corner to the other, depending on your personality and your job.
Okay, let's grab more questions here. But before, I would like to ask Molly to do me a little favor. Could you pass over the iPad I have in my bag, because I would like to be connected with the online audience, because you are invited to put questions as well. You can use the chat function. Please send us your questions you have for Mr. Spohr, and we're looking forward to this. Thank you so much, Molly. Thank you. Okay, so there's another question over here.
Thank you, Mr. Spohr, for attending the school today and for the talk. You mentioned during the discussion that you are, when it comes to the energy costs, as long as you are in the level field with your competitors, you wouldn't say that it impacts you that much in the grand scheme of things. I wanted to ask you a specific question. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, obviously there has been a mutual airspace closure between Russia and all of the Western, at least European, but also United States, Canada, as you know. Would you say that after your interview with Reuters in March, where you mentioned that, of course, there is rising costs because Lufthansa airplanes have to fly around Russia and not through Russia to the Far East destinations, would you say that in the 6 months the field is more or less level between your competitors, let's say in China, and you, or still there are some disadvantages because of that situation that others are benefiting from?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question and an easy answer. There is a disadvantage because some of my competitors are still flying through Russian airspace, or some of my competitors take passengers to and from Russia via Istanbul, for example, or via Dubai, which we don't do because, of course, we follow the sanctions. So there, I think, between having a financial impact on the company and doing what's right, I think gives us the right to do what's right, even though it's giving us a commercial disadvantage. But there is surely no level playing field on this one. Again, as some people can use that airspace and the shortcut and others don't. But we have to live with that. But again, you rightly put it into perspective with my initial answer. Fuel prices alone, including rising fuel prices, tend to be not a disturbing factor. Don't get me wrong, though, I like low fuel prices better than high fuel prices, but again, to your question, level playing field, whether your example where it's not.
Okay. I think there was another question over there.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, again, thank you for sharing your ideas with us. I had a question because you compared Lufthansa with some tech companies. I wanted to ask you if there's a different kind of leader required for different types of industries. For example, you would say you could be able to lead a tech company knowing the particular aspects, technological aspects, for example.
Yeah, I would think there is an overlap between different kind of companies. So we are now hiring digital people for our digital hangar. We are opening up a big digital hangar in 5 locations around the world, and we more or less need 500 people in the next 18 months. So we hire 1 person a day. These people, of course, are partly coming from tech companies or from digital IT jobs in other companies. You don't need to necessarily know a 340-600 from a 340-300 in that job. But when I talk about the company in a broader sense, I do believe a company like Lufthansa attracts people who like to socialize, who like to think about the world being a small place, who like the idea of globalization, of internationalism. And again, in the end, we serve people in a service environment. So, of course, not only my flight attendants should have a feel for what's good for passengers, hopefully also my senior leaders who are not working on the airplane or behind the scenes have a feel for that kind of service attitude. So again, now if I had a chart, I would now draft probably overlapping circles. I think there is a certain amount of people and a certain amount of jobs in any company which attracts the same people than a certain amount of people in another company. But in a more general statement, I think in working in an airline, you need to love the world and you need to love people. Because in the end, it's our people who work with people who are doing the real work in Lufthansa, our flight attendants, our pilots, our call center people, our people at the airport. They are the core of what Lufthansa does every day. So I don't want the culture in the head office to be too far away from these people. I'm not always achieving that, but I'll try.
Thank you.
I'm passing forward a question from the online audience. Anil Malikal asks, what is your take on the current trend of the great resignation? Young talents in their 20s quitting their job due to the lack of perspective within the company. Is it just a trend that sweeps from the US to EU, and how does Lufthansa deal with this?
Yeah, first of all, I have to admit we also have that issue. And as I said before, for us, fluctuation historically has not been much of a problem, but we also see part of this. Young people who don't advance fast enough. Also people partly being less emotionally attached to a company. Also, the way to design your lives becoming more colorful, moving somewhere, taking time off to found a family and you want to be at home for not just a sabbatical, but for some time. People want to open their own company or give it a try. So I think there is a broader way young people look at their next steps than historically. I think that's great, by the way, in a way, for our society, but as an employer, coming back to the question, it is a challenge. So one thing I think we need to do, we need to be open to people returning. I remember a few years ago when you left Lufthansa, you were somebody who deserted you, who was not faithful. And then that person, in a way, probably also thought she or he could never call again after 2 years. Oh, I may change my mind. So that we really changed. We brought some great people back who had some great experiences when they were out, including starting their own companies or working for somebody else. So I think that's one way to answer this. And another way is, of course, in the way it's a zero-sum game. Huh? If people quit there to go somewhere else, by math, since they don't all start their own companies and go to the beach, these people are also available at the job market who were not available before. Huh? Whoever quits somewhere else, by theory, is available to be recruited by Lufthansa. So I'm not saying we are there yet, but I think there's a new labor market out there, not just after university, where all large companies tend to be quite active. There's a labor market of those talents who have had some years of work experience and want to change. So I think we need to get better in recruiting those and not just whining and complaining about those who leave.
Mm-hmm. So there are more questions. Who's got the microphone now? Next one. Okay, where else? Over here, please. Yes.
Yes, dear Mr. Spohr, during the interview you have said multiple times that this was your first pandemic. Let's say there's another pandemic or a different crisis. I just wanted to ask you, how would you act differently? What have you learned from this pandemic?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
I would think, you mentioned that 1 hour loss, or 1 million per hour loss we had. If that happens to a company who's also close to survival, you start to save and cut spending, even in some areas where you know you probably have to, in the end, add additional spending to make up for that. So I think there is a short-term optimization, which in a way is natural, and we talked about leadership behavior and crisis at the beginning of the interview. I probably would try to, personally, but also for my leadership team, to have a little bit of a longer breath, saying, hey guys, I also don't know if this pandemic will last 1, 2, or 3 years, and we didn't, but we will need this and this anyway afterwards. So let's do it, even though we surely don't need it the next years. We did some of these things right. We ordered, as you maybe know, who follow our industry, we were the only airline ordering Airbus 350 wide bodies, probably, for example, in 21, because we knew, hey, these are great prices, and we will need, if the company has any future, we will need additional 350s. So let's order them now. By the time they get delivered, the pandemic is probably over and blah, blah, blah. So some of these decisions we took right, I probably would take more of those decisions. Taking advantage of the crisis, doing things which are anti-cyclical, strongly believing that the company and the business will come back. But it takes, in terms of communication, leadership, that's a difficult balance, huh? Because at the same time you tell people that you have to fire people, reduce the headcount from 140,000 to 100,000, which we did more or less in a year, to invest into things which you will need afterwards is not an easy communication job. Same with people. We probably should even have hired some people in the pandemic who were at the job market, who would never be at the job market again because they were fired somewhere else. Even more difficult, at the same time when you fire people, or in our case, we didn't necessarily fire, but we let people go. So a little bit more looking through the wave, but it's easy to say now when I know that the pandemic is over after 2.5 years. So if I would have the courage when it really happens, I hope I would, but I even more hope I will never get to that situation.
There is an online question which is kind of linked to what you've said. Felicitas Engelhardt said, to what extent have the demands on leaders changed in the recent years? What was your biggest mistake in the area of leadership? And what tip would you want to give to your former self?
Oh, God. That goes in that direction, but it's more than just a pandemic, this question. Huh?
Right.
I think leadership has changed in one way. For example, you remember my little example with our flight instructors telling us when something happens in the cockpit, don't start to push any buttons or touch any buttons, put the fingers under your legs, think first. That has become more and more difficult. The speed of responding, communication, I, by the way, think it's terrible. For example, I try not to send out emails on Sundays because people tend to think if he works on a Sunday, he probably wants an answer on a Sunday. And the least thing I want on a Sunday is an email because then I feel like I have to work. So I tend now to write my emails if I take Sundays to work and send them Monday morning and not requiring people to answer fast. Then the speed of people answering me sometimes is crazy. Maybe as a CEO that's exaggerated, but when do people take time to sit on their fingers and think when they give me an answer within 5 minutes? So I think to slow down culture in a company is a very difficult thing, even for a CEO nowadays. But that, I think sometimes, coming back to the question, it's the answer already to the problem, but the problem is things have become so fast that sometimes the quality, I think, of communication and maybe even decision-making is suffering. That's one thing. Then I also think that monoculture or monothematic cultures in our society is a difficult thing for companies. So if everybody talks about CO2, then to do things as if CO2 is the only topic in the world, which surely some companies have done. And then maybe the next day, God forbid, there is an accident, then everybody talks about just safety. So let's do everything for safety, which we do anyway, by the way. So that was a bad example, but you try to get my message. Then maybe 2 or 3 people quit. You don't want to lose. Oh, our employer brand is down. Let's double salaries. So I think this overreaction to singular events, for sure you see in political environments, I think also for a company is a big danger. So keep the balance. I think in the end, also the stakeholder balance, staff members, customers, shareholders, the environment you live in, to keep that balance and not be totally thrown off balance in those hectic times we live in, I think has changed and requires now, to come to the second part of the question, more counter action to make sure you don't make too many mistakes. And when it comes to all mistakes, as I said, some we even admitted in the pandemic. We overdid it in a way with our crisis management, which caused problems in the times after the crisis, the ramp up. So in our case, the whole world has been watching, not just Lufthansa, by the way, aviation. Yeah, surely we would do things different in that regard now. I think on the one or the other cost program, I think you have to be very careful in terms of cost cutting when the customer is affected, because I think customers don't like to see them being part of your cost cutting, which in our industry is more visible than in others. So there, I think sometimes you have to live with a more customer-centric approach when you optimize the company. I think there is no balance in optimization of a company. The customer should always be more or less impacted. So that maybe is something over the years. And the rest, I don't know you well enough to tell you it.
But there were more questions. One is over here. Could you pass the mic quickly? Where is the microphone? Here? Okay. So one microphone here and another one to the first row, please. Okay, here we go.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all the insights. I think I'm particularly interested in the Lufthansa Innovation Hub. I don't think we got an opportunity to talk about it, but as an entrepreneur myself, I'm really interested in what kind of startup do you invest in and what are some things you evaluate? You talked about some market trends you look at and some company vision, and maybe you want to evaluate if it makes money. I think you also mentioned like prioritizing is important. So what are some factors you prioritize when a startup wants to found a company within the hub? What are some things you look for, and how do you decide to invest in it, and what are some factors you know that's for sure not going to work?
Yeah, looking at the time and the many questions, I'll try to be brief because that alone could fill an evening. We indeed have created a Lufthansa Innovation Hub here in Berlin, but also in Shenzhen and also in Singapore, where we try to invest into startups which are close to our core business. So, and it's very difficult to tell the teams to do that because they, of course, all come up with great ideas, but we are not an investment fund. Lufthansa, if I want to do that, I could also buy Apple shares or whatever shares. So we need to be, in the end, that's what our shareholders expect from us, optimize what we do, But when there are interesting startup companies close to what we do, we have made some successful investments, and of course some unsuccessful investments. Also, sometimes you get access to talent you otherwise wouldn't have access to by working with those companies, or you attract talent to Lufthansa who want to work with startups you otherwise wouldn't be able to recruit. So I think it works various dimensions, but at the end, we are not an investment fund, so investing into any great idea somebody just happens to throw at Lufthansa, I don't think is what we should be doing, and we try to avoid that. When it comes to startups, I think sometimes a little bit too much focus on the next app. So I think I tell young people, let's not just create the next digital platform and the next app, even though there are great ideas there, and we also have invested in some great ideas, but also let's not forget there is a real world out there. Yeah? Engineering work, working with people, recruiting ideas, talking about people today. So when I'm personally involved, which I'm not enough, I try to spread a little bit beyond the next app platform, trying to, just optimize that, be the next Amazon.
Thank you. There's a question here.
First of all, thanks for your engaged responses so far. As a leader, which period did you find more challenging or maybe even more emotionally draining? Spring 2020 or summer 2022? And in those periods, what sort of value did you place on external advice? In your case as a leader, probably strategic consultant. Is it more that they're extremely fast in churning out data, giving you benchmarking? Is it more to have highly intelligent sparrings partners, or something completely different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I would say that the spring of 2020, where we didn't know how the company will survive, and again, I told you before, I always had that inside feeling we would, but more was expected from me than just waking up in the morning and telling people, we'll be okay. So that probably was more stressful in that regard than the summer of 22, where of course everybody was complaining about our service, not ours, fortunately, but the whole industry. I always knew we get out of that one. And we, to be honest, within weeks we stabilized. So even already the month of August has been basically back to 99% in Lufthansa. So it was only, I know many were maybe affected. Overall, there were 100,000 affected, and it was terrible. I don't want to play this down, but this is a crisis which I would know with our tools we'll manage one way or another, and we did. Where 2020 was a totally new situation. The company, we had the best 3 years of our history in 17, 18, and 19. And then suddenly we were forced to go to the government to ask for initially liquidity and then equity to survive. Strategic consultants, of course, a company like us has them in the company anytime. I don't work with them very often because I think the strategic topics, which probably are topics close to me and my team, the company needs to be able to do themselves. It's smaller things on the edge of the universe where you might have the lack of people, the lack of experience, the lack of tools where you really need an advisor. And sometimes you have workload which you cannot cope with your own team. So basically we bring advisors in as an extended workbench, which then indeed can even be core topics like union negotiations or product things, because you're just lacking the amount of people you need for a certain project for a certain amount of time. So again, we work with them like most companies do, but we tend not to have them close to our big strategic decision making.
Mm-hmm. Are there more questions? Yeah, in the back. Oh, here we go.
I was really, really impressed with your answers, the level of honesty and authenticity. I try to teach my students how to have difficult conversations, how to, show what they think and really, really follow through as well. But through their career, they experience a lot of pushback, criticism, and you have experienced that as well. How did you manage to stay true to yourself the way that I perceived you tonight for sure? And what would you be able to teach my students? How you managed to do that despite experiencing pushback and constant criticism in a very public way?
Well, first of all, thanks for the feedback. And it's a difficult question to answer. I totally believe that your private environment plays a huge role. I have a very critical wife. And now the daughters are 14 and 16, they seem to follow their mother. So I really think there's three big decisions in life. Who do I spend my life with? Where do I spend it? And where do I work? And if one of these decisions goes completely wrong, it probably is very difficult to rebalance. So I try to hopefully tell people, try to focus on these three questions in your life and do the best at least to take the right decisions, to have that balanced personality which will maybe allow you to execute the strength you need in difficult times, because everything is easy in good times. And of course you need an environment which is awarding honesty. If you have an environment where every honest expression is put to the media by your people around you, or you have somebody in your board who's just waiting for you to admit mistakes so he can tell the rest of the company he made a mistake again and he even admitted it. Of course, it's not a good environment to create psychological safety even for the top leader. And I know from our questionnaires with our leaders that psychological safety always comes up as a key criticism. And of course, I tell people always, how can that be? We hardly ever fire anybody. In Lufthansa, we have an open communication culture. Well, that's what I think. But when people don't consider themselves psychologically safe, how can I expect them to perceive something which in their view is not there? So I think I have the comfort of working with a team in my executive board who I know many years, some not that long, but I feel comfortable with, and I don't read in the paper the next morning what I've said. I have a supervisory board which has been with me now, I'm in the job 8 years, through difficult times, and they don't let me get the feeling that, oh, Herr Spohr, war mal wieder knapp, dass sie was rausgeflogen wären. So I think psychological safety is also important for the top leaders, again, be it in a private environment created there, be it by successes. People need successes in their careers. If people in their careers have one failure after the other, how can you really be self-confident? So I think when you develop leaders, it's important to put them in jobs where they have a chance to succeed. It's always great also to not succeed somewhere. It builds character. But if you have 3 jobs where you failed at, you probably will not be the same. So I think not to overstress people is a key issue. So to be honest, when it comes to young people, or when it comes to diverse people from abroad, or even when it comes to females, sometimes companies tend to think that, oh, these people need to be pushed faster, and they should, and then people are overstressed, have failures, and then in our culture, I said at the beginning, different than the US a little bit, people sometimes take scars away, which takes a lot of top leadership attention to not have that scar being a problem. So I think there we need to get better, and I try my best to avoid these things of happening. But in the end, people also need to be asking themselves, are they happy in their jobs? I had a meeting the other day of somebody, Spohr, now the 4th boss I had in this company has not seen my talent and has not pushed me. So I say, well, either the 4 of them were wrong, or this might not be the right company to look and see your talent. So that person maybe indeed better leaves, rather than being unhappy and waiting for the number boss 5, 6, 7 to see his or her wonderful talent. So people need to be a little bit not happy in the sense of happiness, but tend to be happy in terms of confidence in what they do to live through the stress you just described.
Well, I would like to take this as a wonderful last conclusion, not only in regard to the time which is running out, but also because you built wonderfully the bridge to what Professor Korotov mentioned in the beginning. He also talked about values in leadership, and you summarized brilliantly what your values are, and I think it came over very, very clear what your values are and what is leading you through the crisis. So thank you so much for this very, very enlightening talk, and for sharing your experiences with us and for your openness. Thank you so much, Carsten Spohr.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to make some little announcements. If you are inspired by what you have heard now, you have a wonderful opportunity to join a great format. The IZF, the Institute for Zukunftsfähige Führung, is offering a talk, an online talk. It's called Macchiato mit Schuss, Today's Global Leaders. This is an online event taking place on Friday, September 16th from 1 to 2 p.m. and you're invited to share your impressions of what you've heard today and talk about how to manage transformations and other crises as a leader. There is, if you ask yourself how to get there, there is a screen outside or some screens outside where you find a QR code. You can take a photo. There is a link which leads you to this event. And you can also watch this conversation with Carsten Spohr. Again, you find it on the YouTube channel of the ESMT. Please look at the playlist for today's Global Leader at YouTube. You'll find this conversation, I think, in a couple of days. Yeah, very soon. Okay, and of course, we will continue this series, Today's Global Leaders. Our next guest will be a top CEO from the automotive industry. We have given his name. Ola Kelenius will be our next guest, Chair of the Board of Management, Mercedes-Benz Group. And this will be on November 7th at 6 p.m. here at ESMT. So please save the date. And now our throats are really dry, and we are happy to invite you for a small reception, which will be in the lobby out there. Looking forward to talk to you. Have a great evening, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you also the online audience. Have a nice evening. Thank you.